Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I wanted to talk about that in October I tracked my reading time for a month. So I've never really tried to track my reading time over the course of a month to see like how much time do I spend reading. I just always assume it's a lot of time probably. I do get questions from people once in a while if it comes up how many books I have read in a year or something like that, and they ask like, how much time do you spend reading? And I'm always like, I don't know. So I've never really been like motivated to track my reading time, but at the end of September I was talking to my mom about that September was a bit of a slower reading month for me. So she was asking about how much time do I dedicate to reading, and really she wanted to know how much time I spend reading because she felt like it would motivate her to read more, to know how much time I was spending reading. I'm not sure why that would be motivating to her, but you know, if she finds it motivating, because my mom also loves books. She has so many books and she would really love to read more of her books. So she was always looking for things that will motivate her to read more because she loves books. And so I decided to track my reading for the month because I decided, you know, maybe it would be interesting to know how much time I actually spend reading, and I would like to, you know, be able to tell my mom, and maybe it will motivate her more to read. I'm always here for motivating people to read more. So for the month of October, I tracked all of my reading time. I did include both physical books and audiobooks for tracking, so I'm counting all of that in reading time. So for audiobooks, it was really easy to track my reading time because it tells you how long the book is. And if I sped it up, I would just, you know, do the math of like, okay, how much time does that mean this book actually took at a faster speed? But that was pretty easy for tracking my reading time. Reading physical books was a little bit tougher to track reading time, so I got an app to help me out, which I used the Bookly app. It has a few different features in it. One of the ways that it works is you can just enter the information about a reading session. You say how many pages you read, how much time it was, and like the date, and it just logs that information. Or you can kind of start a little timer in the app so that it will time you as you're reading, and then at the end of that reading session you enter what page you got to, and it'll figure out for you like how many pages you read per minute based on how much time it spent. And it kind of keeps track of all of those stats and will report back to you. It also gives you information about how much time you have spent reading this book, and then based on your average reading speed, how much more time you have left to read in that book. So it was just like a really interesting way to track my reading, and it gave me some really helpful stats and tools to track it in that way. And to be clear, I'm not like being sponsored by the Bookly app. I'm not cool enough to be sponsored by anybody. It's just an app that I found and I felt was really helpful for this. So all of that being said, what did I learn from my experience of tracking my reading time? So I learned some things first about my reading itself, and then also kind of about my motivation with reading and how I like to read. So in terms of just how much time did I spend reading, in October I spent approximately 55 hours reading, which seems like both a lot and not that much. October actually wasn't a huge reading month for me, and the last week of October I read absolutely nothing. So in an average reading month, that actually number would probably be higher than that. But for this month, or for October, it was 55 hours, which comes to an average of about 1.8 hours every day. Although if I take out that last week, because I know that I wasn't reading anything in the last week of October, then it comes out to about 2.5 hours every day of reading. However, that is not actually what my reading was like. My reading was, of course, much more sporadic than that, and there were some days that I didn't read anything or read like a couple of pages, and some days where I would sit down and read like 150 pages. I also thought it was really interesting to see the average pages per minute that I read for each book, and I found out that I actually read faster than I thought I did, which is surprising to me because I have done like timed reading tests to figure out what your reading speed is, and I usually come out as a very slow reader, and I always feel like I'm a very, very slow reader. I don't feel like I get through books very quickly. but I found out that most books, my average pages per minute, which usually reading speed is measured in words per minute, but in this case, it's doing pages per minute. But my average pages per minute was about 1 page per minute, which to me seems pretty fast, actually. It's a lot faster, at least, than I was expecting my reading to be. When I tried to do some research about what's the average reading speed in pages per minute, because as I said, it's usually measured in words per minute, but the average word per minute is about 200 to 250 words per minute, which then turns into about 2 pages or 2 minutes per page. So I was spending 1 minute per page reading, which is way faster than I was expecting, especially since I usually think of myself as such a slow reader. But also something that was nice is knowing that I had such an even average of 1 page per minute. That means that I can look at a book and assume that however many pages it has, that's approximately how many minutes it's going to take me to read that book, which is really interesting to know that I have a way of estimating that now. But I did also find out that there are some books that just take me longer to read than other books. And it was interesting because sometimes there are books that I read that I feel like it just takes me longer to read them than others, and it turns out that's true. There are some books and some writing styles that just took me longer than other books to read. So one book that I started in October but I didn't end up finishing was Foundry Side by Robert Jackson Bennett, and this is one that I felt like it was just taking me longer to get through this book than a lot of other books, and when I checked my average reading speed, it was about 1.5 minutes per page, which means that I was actually reading it more slowly than my average of 1 minute per page. So that feeling was actually correct, which was interesting to know. And then I also happened to read Vengeful by V.E. Schwab in October, and I always feel like I fly through V.E. Schwab's books. Whether I like them or not, I just find her writing style really easy to read, and I just feel like they're really fast reads. And again, I was actually proven right by that, because when I was reading Vengeful, my average was about half a minute per page. So I was reading that book about twice as fast as my average reading speed. So I do fly through her books, and there's something about her writing that is just really fast and easy to read. And that was really interesting to know that my kind of instinct feeling about how my reading was going was actually accurate. Something that I learned about my own reading habits is that I actually don't often sit down and read for long periods of time, which I had never really noticed before. But once I started timing my reading and noticing like how long it was from when I started to when I stopped, and then I would have to be like, oh, this is a full session, so now I have to enter, you know, my data of like how many pages did I read. I realized that very often I read in about 20-minute stretches. I tend to sit down and just read for about 20 minutes and then move on to do something else, and then come back and read for another 20 minutes and then go off. So I don't often sit down and read for like an hour. And that was something that I thought was kind of interesting. I hadn't realized about my reading habits before, was that I don't often like sit and read for long periods of time, that I just read little bits here and there. But kind of getting into how this affected my reading and my motivation, because I started timing my reading, I started reading for longer periods of time. So I started reading for like an hour at a time, which was really interesting, and I feel like that made me kind of get through books more quickly because I was dedicating larger chunks of time. And what I figured out is that at least in the beginning of the month, I found timing my reading to be really motivating, because it made it kind of like a fun game that I could get to see like my stats and everything. It also kind of this was an experiment, you know, and I love experiments. Like, there are so many like little life experiments that I'm running on myself and my life at all times. So I love a good experiment. And so it was really motivating to me to have this experiment that I was going to get like data and results from. And it also really helped me to focus on my reading, because as I said, I get distracted really easily while I'm reading. And I found that because I was timing my reading and because this was an experiment, I was really focused because I wanted to have accurate data. This is making me I sound like such a nerd, but it's true. I wanted to have accurate data for my experiment. So if I had a timer going and it said that I had been reading for 15 minutes, I wanted to make sure that I had spent all of that 15 minutes focused and reading. And so it really motivated me to stay focused on my reading so that I would have the most accurate results for my little experiment. So that was really cool that it was motivating me to read for longer periods of time. It was helping me to stay focused, and it was really fun to like see my results from it. I did find that towards the later part of the month, when I started getting much busier and there was a lot more pressure that I had from work and school and things like that, so I was much busier at the end of the month, and then having to time my reading kind of became a deterrent for me because I didn't really have time to set aside large chunks of time reading, and then I felt like I didn't really want to have to time my reading, and it made it feel to me like reading was more of like an event that I had to set time aside for, and I just didn't feel like I had the time for that, and I didn't feel like I had the mental energy to like sit down and really concentrate and focus and read in the way that I wanted to in order to get that like accurate data for my experiment. So it actually kind of became a deterrent for me towards the end of the month. And then that last week of the month, I just didn't read anything. But that didn't have to do with timing my reading. That was just because I didn't have the time or energy to like do anything. So overall, I felt like this was a really interesting experiment, and I'm really glad that I did it. It's interesting to know that I have kind of a consistent, like an average reading speed. Although looking back at the books that I read in October, I realized that most of them were books that in general were like the writing style wasn't especially dense, and so I don't know if I did read a denser writing style, how fast would I read that? And a lot of the books that I really love, some of my favorite books, do tend to be denser writing styles because they're either high fantasy or historical fantasy, historical fiction, and ones that are, I like books that are more slow paced and lyrically densely written. And so I didn't read any books like that during the month of October. So I'm kind of curious as to whether I would read those more slowly. Those are ones that I don't feel like I'm reading slowly because I'm enjoying myself so much, so they don't feel like slow reads, but they may actually be slower just because I know it's a denser writing style. So I don't think I'm going to continue to consistently time my reading. I don't think I'm going to consistently use the Bookly app anymore, but I may continue doing small experiments with specific kinds of books just to see. I want to have more information about what books do I read quickly, and I would like to test that out with different authors, different writing styles, different genres, and even different age groups. I wonder if I read adult books any more slowly than YA or middle grade. I don't know if that will make a difference in how quickly I read those authors or those writing styles or those stories. So this has been a really interesting experiment for me. I'm also just like really glad. I feel like I learned a lot about my own reading habits. So it was really fun to do. And as I said, I'm gonna keep doing small experiments. So that is all for this video. I hope you found this interesting. I found this to be a really interesting experiment. So I hope that you guys enjoyed hearing my results. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.